didn't really get there.
I started talking about nuclear power plants in the U.S. and maybe I really wasn't answering your question there. As far as the radiation from that exchange, I think there would be a lot of it. If you detonate a weapon on the surface as opposed into the air, you get like a really nasty fallout. But what happens there is those sorts of the fallout from that, it gets rained out and spread more regionally than globally.
Okay.
You have to have about 100 kiloton weapon for the fireball to go above the troposphere, or where the weather takes place, up into the stratosphere, where it's above cloud level and it can't get rained out. That's where the term fallout came from. When we had all these big, in the South Pacific, we detonated all those hydrogen bombs, and they were enormous. The largest one was 15 million tons of TNT.
Wow.
And so those fireballs went into the stratosphere, and it only takes about 2 weeks for the wind to blow it all the way around the planet. When you have a nuclear detonation, you create literally hundreds of different types of radioactive isotopes or elements. But most of them have very short, they self-destruct in a very short matter of time. They call it a half-life. But there's some that don't, and those particularly, it's strontium-90, and that gets into your bones and your teeth, and cesium-137 that gets into your organ systems and tissues. Those have 30-year half-lives. And then, of course, there's uranium and plutonium. When you detonate, most of the bombs had plutonium pits, and even the very most efficient bomb doesn't have all the plutonium fission. It's a lot of it's blasted into microparticles. Is
there any such thing as a clean bomb?
No, not. They all produce, and there's no such thing as a clean nuclear fission. Anytime you split an atom, you produce a lot of radioactive byproducts. And most of these, like the cesium-137 and strontium-90, haven't really existed during the entire time complex life has evolved and developed. And so it's new to us. And that's one of the things I think that's been ignored or almost suppressed. They focus a lot on external doses of radiation. But very equally or even more important is if this stuff gets into the biosphere, these long-lived radioisotopes like cesium-137, and it gets into your foodstuffs, and then you eat it, and you ingest it or inhale it.
Right.
It can have it causes other diseases besides radiation, besides leukemia and cancer. I spent a year helping to translate a study that was done in Belarus, that was done after the Chernobyl nuclear power plant blew up.
Oh, yes.
And about 25% of Belarus was seriously contaminated, and the most predominant radioisotope is cesium-137, and it gets into everything. Like even the wood, when they burn firewood for heating and cooking, it turns their chimneys into like small nuclear reactors, and but the children there are really sick. Only less than 10% of the children in these contaminated areas are considered to be healthy. And the study that I got translated was done over a 9-year period. They examined 100,000 children, and they did thousands of human tissue samples done from autopsies of children and infants that had died in these areas. And they found that the cesium concentrates in the endocrine tissues as well as the heart, the pancreas, the spleen. And this led to all sorts of problems like heart attack, stroke, hypertension. They call it Chernobyl heart. Is something that these kids have that if they don't have an operation, they die. And so after the scientists made this presentation, he went home and he presented to the parliament in Belarus. He went home, the police came and kicked his door in. They arrested him. They went to his medical institute and destroyed all his archived slides and samples from 9 years' worth of research, and they put him in a prison camp for 6 years. So this information hasn't been made public. I presented it at the New York Academy of Medicine about a little over a year ago, and but it's if you go to the EPA website and you look at cesium-137, they say it's uniformly distributed in the body. Well, it's not true, but again, the nuclear industry has so much influence and power that they dispute all of this, of course, and they say the sort of doses that these children are exposed to pose no threat to human health. So there's a real fundamental argument going on here. But these are the health physicists that are trained by the nuclear industry. They have their own safety standards they develop. And these health physicists actually aren't doctors. They have no real training in medicine. But they dispute what the scientists and the doctors are saying.
I see. Well, the recent nuclear accident in Japan, yes, I believe there was some 137 distributed to some fairly wide degree.
Right. That was what my presentation at the New York Academy of Medicine was about, was the massive contamination of Japan with Cesium-137.
What are going to be the effects downline of that?
Well, the nuclear industry will tell you none. They'll say, oh, there's nothing, no big deal, and they still have an area that's an exclusion zone. But they say, well, we're opening that up. They're trying to make it scrape off enough dirt so people can drive into these cities that they wash the roofs off on and pretend like it's safe. But I don't think we know. That's the worst thing about all this, all the atmospheric weapons tests. We detonated 100 atomic bombs in the deserts of New Mexico. And I honestly think that's the largest environmental disaster in American history. They kept all the fallout secret from people. They didn't even know what was happening. But so all of the combination of that has raised the amounts of ionizing radiation to much higher than, there really wasn't background levels until we started detonating nuclear weapons. And we don't know what the long-term genetic consequences of this stuff is.
Okay.
And I think that it could lead to all sorts of genetic diseases that, maybe are just starting to appear now.
Sure. I get computer messages as we do the program. Mark asks, could you please ask about the effects and even explain, if you can, a neutron bomb, a neutron weapon?
Sure. Well, it's designed, neutrons are atomic particles that are found in the nucleus of the atom. And when atoms break apart or fission in a nuclear chain reaction, neutrons are, sprayed out. So they have a weapon that's designed to sort of minimize the blast and maximize the radiation effects of neutrons. So it kills the people, but it doesn't destroy as much of the property as it would otherwise. But it's it's certainly it's a weapon of mass destruction and a genocide, really. So.
Well, I guess in a war that would be a big potential goal, wouldn't it? I mean, you want to destroy your enemy, but you want the physical assets if possible.
Yeah, traditionally that's what war is all about. You want to conquer the other country and take advantage of their wealth and their people. But that's a problem with nuclear war. Besides the fact that we'll all starve to death afterwards, the contamination and destruction from these weapons goes, beyond time and space. We're talking, it transcends, it'll last for centuries or, millennia, and they really are, they're not precise weapons. If you look at the weapons that NATO has, for example, you were mentioning those in your introduction, I think,
yes.
The B-61 bomb that the U.S. it's actually a new nuclear weapon that we're creating. It has they call it dial yield, a variable yield, where it goes from 300 tons or 0.3 kilotons of TNT up to 50,000 tons. There's different mods or models. There's some that actually go up to 170,000 tons.
Wow.
So, but these weapons, they're guided weapons, and so they can be used very precisely, but it makes them more what they would call usable. And so therefore, it makes it more likely that they will be used. There's this whole psyche of, well, we have to have a credible threat. And in order to make our threat believable, we have to have weapons that it looks like we would use them. But, we're backing ourselves into a corner where someday, what happens if we do have to use them? Then you actually start a nuclear war. And if you're fighting with somebody that has nuclear weapons like Russia, they have plenty of, weapons like that, battlefield weapons they call them, or tactical, and they can respond in kind. And all the war games that were ever done with NATO, for example, during the Cold War, once they crossed, they called it the nuclear fire break. Once they went from using conventional high explosive weapons to nuclear, it was only a matter of time before it escalated into just a complete nuclear war, a holocaust. So I wonder if our leaders know that.
Yes, how quickly do you feel that threshold would be? Let's just have an example here. Let's say that Putin decides that he wants what they had, the old Soviet Union. And they begin moving into state after state after state, attempting to reform what they had. Now, to some degree, NATO, I guess, would at some point step in, but boy, oh boy, when you start talking about it in real life, understanding what would happen if we stepped in, we would be probably really cautious. And I don't know how many countries would fall before we decided we would step in. And once we did, even a small exchange, artillery, for example, they have nuclear weapons that can be fired by artillery, right?
Well, the Russians do. We did. I'm not sure if we still have those or not, but we certainly have plenty of what we would call tactical nuclear weapons.